Hi, my name is Manish Gupta, and in this video, I'm going to talk about cluster-guided label generation in extreme classification. Okay, so let's get started. Um, the question is very similar to the one I asked in the previous video. How can we use T5 model for generating labels in extreme multi-label classification? Okay, but then in this paper, of course, they experiment with many other interesting methods. Okay. So recall that what is extreme multi-label classification? Well, it is that multi-label classification problem setting where the number of labels are in millions. Okay, so therefore it's a very complex problem to solve. Very recently, people have started solving it using generative mechanisms like T5. Now, what you see here as the first one, the simplest way of using T5, right? So essentially, if you have a data point and you want to classify it into several, several labels, multiple labels, you can set it up as a sequence-to-sequence learning problem where you basically give the multi-label input, the data point text input as input, right? Data point text associated with the data point as input, and you expect the T5 model to predict the set of labels appropriately. Okay. Well, the set of labels need to be provided in some order, and particularly in this work, they basically sort the target labels in decreasing order of frequencies, and that is how they provide for training, right? So essentially, once you have provided those labels, of course, you measure cross and drop loss in terms of how well your T5 model can actually generate those same labels. Okay? So that's called as XLGen base, and that's basically the basic model. However, you can do something more. So essentially, for example, what you could do is to take this set of labels and essentially come up with some features for those labels using popularly what is called as PFA, in the sense it is basically feature aggregation, right? So in simple words, what it means is as follows. You want some sort of an embedding for the label. The way you do that is basically you first get an embedding for each of those data points or the documents, right? Let's say TF-IDF vector kind of representation, back of verse TF-IDF vector representation. And then you take the average of those positive training documents in the sense that you take those trained documents for which this label is relevant, and you aggregate across all of them so as to get a label representation, right? So as to get an embedding for the label. Now, on this label embedding, you can actually, so this is popularly called as a PFA embedding because you're aggregating features across data points which are positive for where this label is positive. Okay, so positive instance feature aggregation. Okay. Now, on this particular representation, you can do k-means and k-means clustering. So that basically gives you several clusters. And then the other two methods, XLGen BCL and XLGen MCG, they both depend on these clusterings. So the idea is to say that given a data point, first you could practically just decide what cluster your labels could belong to and then guess the actual labels. Okay. In fact, the XLGen BCL essentially, do multitask learning. They actually predict both the set of labels as well as the clusters together. So this arrow ideally should be outgoing, right? So in the sense that you give the data points document text as input, and you expect it to generate the labels and the cluster IDs also. Okay. So let's say if we had like 6 different clusters, I mean, if the data set was very small and you just had 6 clusters, then you would then maybe the labels that you have belong to these two clusters. So the labels could belong to multiple clusters, and therefore you have like ones in those places, but clusters to which these relevant labels don't belong to, they have zeros here in this vector. Okay. So XLGen BCL is the second level setup where it's a multitask learning setup where you're basically trying to predict both the labels as well as label clusters. In a multitask setup, basically having two heads at the end of the T5 model, right? One is generative head, and the other is basically a classification head. So it is basically at the end of the T5 encoder that you essentially try to do these predictions. Notice that the clusters are actually not used at inference time. They are basically just used to make the decoder, make the model robust, right? And once you have made the model robust, this head is useless. You can just throw it away. At inference time, all you need is labels. Okay. Now, on the other hand, the third technique is XLGen MCG. So this is also a multitask setup, but then let's see how this setup works. Okay. So essentially, of course, and in both these previous setups, by the way, you use a prefix called multi-label to tell T5 that you are trying to do multi-label classification. Okay. Now, in this third setup called as XLGen MCG, you try to do two different tasks, in fact, right? And you actually try to do them simultaneously. So the first task is it's also a multi-label task. So basically, you're trying to generate labels, but then here you're essentially supplying not just the text of the data point, but also cluster sequence. So you're saying that cluster 2 and cluster 6 are relevant. Now generate labels. Okay, now generate labels. On the other hand, simultaneously, you're also doing another task. So in this task, essentially, you are essentially taking the data point text like this, and you're trying to generate the cluster IDs which are associated with this data point. So in some ways, you're doing simultaneously two different generation tasks. Okay, so that is how this model is trained. Now, of course, for the first task, you use the prefix multi-label, but for the second task, you use the prefix multi-cluster. So as to tell it that, hey, you have to generate multiple clusters or multiple labels respectively. Okay. In this BCL kind of task, they found that using 80 clusters is a good idea, but for MCG kind of setup, they found 20 clusters is a good idea. Right? They also tried k-means clustering versus hierarchical agglomerative clustering, but they found that k-means clustering gave best results. Okay. Now, lastly, when you're trying to generate these labels, what order should you give those labels in at train time? Right. So at train time, they basically try to, what they found the best is sorting the target labels in decreasing order of frequencies. However, they also tried to sort the labels in the increasing order of frequency or randomly shuffling the labels or sort of, disabling the position embedding for the T5 model so as to not care about the ordering at all, right? So all of these four techniques, the best thing that worked is the frequency-based technique, sort the labels, sort the target labels in the decreasing order of their frequencies, okay? So in both of these cases, whether it is XLGen BCL or XLGen MCG, they essentially train on both the cluster prediction task as well as on the label generation task, and therefore the loss function contains two different parts. So when they're generating things, they basically use beam search with the size 5, and also when they basically want to essentially predict this multi-cluster output, they essentially take they average out the last hidden states from the pre-trained T5 encoder. So when you have your text input given in, for every position you essentially get output from the T5 model, T5 encoder. You take all of those outputs, average pool them, and essentially use them so as to predict this multi-cluster output. Okay. And you do this because T5 encoder does not have a CLS token. Otherwise, it was very easy to just use the CLS token and then use it for prediction. Okay. Now, since they're predicting a set of labels, ranking metrics are not really applicable. So unlike the previous video that I recorded about open vocabulary XML, where they basically tried to still come up with ranking metrics and scoring and so on, here the authors clearly say that, hey, when you're using label generation, ranking does not really make a lot of sense, right? So therefore, they don't really use ranking metrics, but they basically report micro-averaged F1 and macro-averaged F1 scores. Okay. So how does this XLGen perform? So how good is T5 in terms of coming up with the extreme classification labels? Okay, so they perform several kinds of evaluations. So let's talk about full label performance first. So full label performance basically means you care about tail labels, torso labels, head labels, all of them. Okay. And on 4 different data sets, they basically compare with the 3 previous extreme classification methods using micro and macro F1 scores. Okay. So for all of those 3, you basically observe that all the bolds are in the lower block, which basically means that XLGen outperforms the traditional extreme classification methods on these 4 data sets in terms of micro and macro recall for sure. Okay, macro and micro F1, right? So what is also observed is that compared to XLGen base, typically these 2 methods, XLGen BCL and XLGen MCG, are better. So basically clustering helps. That's the broad idea. Okay. Now, if you look at the tail performance, so essentially this is the performance for tail labels, in the sense those labels which occur 0 times in the training set or 1 time in the training set. Okay, so that's that 0 time or 1 time in the training set. Now, for those, if you basically observe clearly, the results that you see here is just 11.1 using, and these are macro F1 values, so 11.1 compared to, let's say, 28.2 there. So of course, there are problems. So if the label was not in the training set, clearly the models don't perform well. In fact, the traditional traditional extreme classification methods give you a recall of 0, or rather a macro f1 of 0, when the data point, the label has not been seen in the training set at all. Okay. Even for those data points which have been seen once in the training set, the results are pretty poor for traditional extreme classification methods. However, the T5 based generative extreme classification method still gives you much reasonable results. So that's that. So, well, I was comparing Wiki 1031K with Wiki 10. Yeah, I should have compared with this. So 11.1 is not as good as many other numbers that you see. Well, I mean, for XLGen, it's still reasonable, but then for XR transformer, XR linear, and attention XML, it's actually pretty bad. Okay? So that's that. Now, as a third setting, they simulate this setting of positive and unlabeled labels. So here, what they do is to take, from the test set, they basically take a data instance in the test set. Out of its labels, positive labels, they basically remove 50% of them. Okay. So the idea is that they remove 50% of the labels, and that's basically called as, they refer to this 50% guy as deficit rate. So the idea is that in this PU setting, you randomly eliminate 50% of the labels. So not from the test set, but from the train set. So in the train set, you have lots of labels, great, but you randomly eliminate 50% of the labels across the entire set for every data instance. Okay. So this basically means that your training data has gone sparse. Now, in face of sparsity, what happens? So even in face of sparsity, your macro F1 for XLGen MCG stays quite high. However, the macro F1 for XR transformer and XR linear and so on, it basically reduces. They reduce significantly. For example, in attention XML, 21 basically becomes 11.3, right? Comparing for Wiki 500K dataset itself. But if you look at XLGen MCG, well, that is pretty robust. It does not really drop that much. Okay, so that's that. So essentially, even for the PU setting, positive and unlabeled setting, where you basically randomly eliminated 50% of your training data labels, you still have very reasonable accuracies for the test set. Okay. Now, amongst the decoding strategies, they basically try various kinds of decoding strategies, like beam search with size 5. They also do top P and top K sampling, and they also do sampling with 0.8 temperature. Amongst all of these, they actually find that beam search with the size 5 gives them the best results. Okay. So here are so lastly, they also tried experiments with GPT-3. They basically said, well, if you're generating labels, why not generate using GPT-3? Okay. And then they generated in a 0-shot, 1-shot, 5-shot ICL setting, in context learning setting. So basically by giving 1 exemplar, 5 exemplars, or 0 exemplars. Okay. But then when you compare in terms of micro and macro recall, surprisingly, GPT is not as good as T5 in terms of generating these labels. Now, of course, GPT is not fine-tuned as such, but even 5-shot GPT is not really as good. Okay. So these are actually pretty surprising results, because even 5-shot GPT across different data sets and across both the metrics is not as good as the T5 model that they propose along with clustering. Okay. So, and here is a qualitative example to show you how their method works. So this is a Wikipedia page for Diet Coke and Mentos eruption. And there is some text also associated. So that's the input text. Now, if you ask a human to label, provide tags or labels for this Wikipedia page, they give labels like beverage, chemistry, Coke, Diet Coke, eruption, eruption video, explosion, food, fun, interesting, funny, and so on. Okay. So a previously proposed attention XML 2019 extreme classification method gives some reasonable labels. And these are labels using XLGen and GPT-3. Now notice, labels in blue are the labels that actually match with what was present in the human label set. So it's already present, right? So labels which are struck out, those labels are essentially wrong ones. So they are incorrect labels which are struck out. Okay. And then those labels which are in red were not present in the label set at all, but they're all reasonable labels. They're all pretty reasonable labels. Now, interestingly, as you observe, Wikipedia, Wiki, these are pretty reasonable. Even attention XML predicts them, but they were not present in the human labeled set. They were actually present in the training set though, okay? So it's not like they're new labels altogether, but it's just that no human or rather humans find it very difficult to label exhaustive list of things for any data point, and therefore these are like missing labels: humor, wiki, Wikipedia, and so on. Okay, so these are all reasonable labels, but not present in the original label set. Now, what is more interesting are these yellow highlighted labels like soda predicted by XLGen, or geyser or physical reaction, or Mentos predicted by GPT-3. These are labels which are not present in the label set, but they are really good labels, right? So they are essentially awesome labels which XLGen or GPT-3 are able to predict by using their knowledge about world knowledge, factual knowledge, or English knowledge, and so on, and by making use of some phrases in the input description itself. So other carbonated beverages makes these models believe that soda is a reasonable label, or geyser or Mentos are all reasonable labels to be provided to this data point. Okay, so in summary, in this video, I talked about how to best use T5 for extreme classification, and there's more work going on in this area, right? So they basically propose this method, which does XLGen, right? XLGen, which actually does label prediction along with cluster prediction. XLGen can also create completely unseen but still relevant labels like soda. GPT-3 can also do something very similar, like it can produce things like geyser and Mentos and so on. XLGen outperforms the classification baselines, as we saw, like attention XML, and it also significantly improves the long tail performance, and even provides improved performance in the positive but unlabeled positive and unlabeled setting, positive and unlabeled PU setting. So that's it for this video. Hope you liked the video. Thank you for watching. Connect with me on my LinkedIn or look at my research on my homepage. Thank you.